Thank you for coming out tonight, especially on what I think has been the best weather day of the year so far. So I definitely appreciate that you made it out to come spend some time with us here this evening. My name's Jeremy Jackson. I'm the director for the Center for the Study of Public Choice and Private Enterprise here at NDSU. The center has a mission statement that I just put up on a slide. The center engages in research and educational programs, much like this one, to uncover institutions and policies that encourage and enhance human well-being. So what we're ultimately after is making people's lives better off. And we'll hear a lot about, I think, some institutions later in the talk today. I do want to say a few things about some of the programs and opportunities that we have coming up for you. First of all, if you haven't already, we do have a presence on social media, Twitter and Facebook. If you want to keep informed about the things that we have going on, we're always posting about the opportunities there. Some of the opportunities that we have, for instance, we actually have a job that's open. So we currently have an intern. Actually, Nate's in the back, current intern. We're going to have an opening for, he's graduating, so we need a new intern. So please, if you're interested, you'll have the opportunity to help us with social media, producing some of the documents, help us editing some things, and actually we're trying to expand some of our programs into some other areas, so you'll be able to help us with some of those things. We also have a reading group program, and I know some of you in the room have been a part of those reading group programs. We have the Mansur-Olson Scholars Group. Next semester, they're going to be reading Driving and Sustaining Change in Life and Business. Dr. Jim Caton will be leading this group. So you'll be given a couple of books. The group will read those over the course of the semester with meetings throughout the semester. For participating in the group, you also get, in addition to awesome conversation and a couple of free books, you also get a $500 scholarship for your participation. So keep that in mind. We're currently accepting applications. You can see right there it says apply online on our website. So please apply if you're interested. We have another talk later in the semester, so another Capitalism and Society lecture. We'll be featuring Jason Lusk. He's an agricultural economist, actually chair of the Ag Econ department at Purdue University. He'll be talking on the future of food. And again, there'll be pizza, pop, and an awesome presentation with that. Another announcement, if you've been to our talks in the past, you're familiar with this. We tend to use a program called Slido, which if you have your cell phones, you can always go ahead and like us on social media while you have your cell phone out. But you can also download the Slido app. So if you go to the App Store, it's a free app. It allows you to ask questions. So at the end, we'll have a Q&A time. But rather than passing the mic around, you can ask your questions on Slido. And you can actually see the questions that are being asked. And you can like questions as well. So it helps us to figure out which questions you actually are most interested in having answered. And it also helps us just keep everything a little orderly. So please download that app. So it's Slido, it's written up there. And then you'll need this code, so the code number is V532. And with that, I'm going to introduce today's speaker. Alexander William Salter received his PhD in economics from George Mason University. Currently, he is an assistant professor in the Rawls College of Business at Texas Tech University. He is also the Comparative Economics Research Fellow at Texas Tech University's Free Market Institute and a research fellow with the American Institute for Economic Research's Sound Money Project. And he is the author of more than 50 scholarly papers and 40 articles in popular outlets. Please join me as we welcome Alex Salter.
Can everybody hear me? Is speaking this loud good for you guys? Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Jackson, for that lovely introduction. Good evening, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. Tonight, as Dr. Jackson hinted, I'm going to be making an institutional argument, and specifically an argument about the form our monetary and financial institutions ought to take. The title of my talk is Money and the Rule of Law. As an aside, I actually have a book proposal under review right now at Cambridge University Press that's based on this talk, so please wish me luck. Hope that that goes well. Should be hearing about that soon. I'm going to give you a preview of coming attractions tonight. We're going to be talking about what the rule of law is, how it applies to monetary institutions or not, and why you should care, why that matters for overall economic and social well-being. So first, the standard disclaimer. The views expressed in this talk are solely my own, and they do not in any way represent the views of the institutions with which I am affiliated. Now that we have the disclaimer out of the way, let's get into the meat of the talk. So if we're going to talk about monetary institutions, we first need to have an accurate understanding of the economic function of money. Why do we use money? Why trade money for goods? Why not just trade goods for goods? Wouldn't it be easier? Barter economies have existed in the past. In fact, for most of human history, we've had a barter economy of some form or another. Why use money? Turns out it's not easier to engage in a barter economy than it is to engage in a monetary economy. There are very good reasons to engage in what economists would call indirect exchange, where we trade the goods that we produce, not for the goods that we finally wish to consume, but for an intermediate good. That intermediate good, once it becomes generally accepted in the economy, becomes money, and then we turn around and trade that intermediate good for whatever we finally want to consume. It turns out that massively economizes on the cost of engaging in economic exchanges. Money has been called perhaps the greatest labor-saving technology that mankind has invented, and I think that that may be true. Because think about it, if you're engaged in a barter transaction, it's not only the case that you have to find someone who has goods that you want, that person also has to want what you have. It's called the double coincidence of wants problems. If we use money, that problem is solved. Whatever I produce, I can sell it for money, and then because everyone accepts money, I can turn around and then trade with that. It makes engaging in economic exchanges much, much easier. So where does money come from? The economist you'll want to engage and read on this is named Carl Menger. He wrote a very influential article called On the Origins of Money, published in 1892. This is the standard economist explanation as to where money comes from. Nobody planned money. There was no wise philosopher king who sat down and said, this barter thing is really inefficient. Wouldn't it be great if we had monetary exchange? Instead, money as a social institution gradually arose over time. The way it worked is first people who produced relatively unsaleable or liquid goods found that they had a really hard time exchanging what they produced for what they finally wanted to consume. So instead of looking to trade what they produced for what they finally wanted to consume, they decided to engage in indirect exchange. Imagine that you raise cattle. That's the good that you produce. You don't live in a monetary economy. Now, it turns out that it's really hard to exchange cattle directly for something that you want to consume. For one, cattle vary greatly in quality and features. On the other hand, cattle are not easily divisible. You cannot cut a cow in half and give someone half of a cow. And furthermore, cows are costly to store and transport. Compare that to another good, say gold. 1 grain of gold is as good as any other grain of gold. You can take a pile of gold and cut it in half and it's still usable, it's still perfectly fine. And gold is relatively low cost to store and transport. So as people realize this, they understand, hey, look, I have cows, I want rope and turnips and whatever else. It's going to be really hard for me to trade my cows directly for that. It'll be easier if I trade cows for gold and then gold for rope and turnips and whatever else I want to consume. The more people start to do this, the more we dovetail to a common medium of exchange in an economy. And that's what money is, the economy's most saleable or more liquid good, the good that we use to buy all other goods. It's also, once it becomes money, the common denominator of economic exchanges. It's 1/2 of all exchanges, and so pretty much all economic exchanges that we do, and especially in modern economies, takes the form of money. There might still be some isolated pockets of barter, maybe under the table transactions or something like that, but for the most part, money is the common denominator of all markets. Is there a problem with the slides? Oh, okay. So it turns out that the use of money actually enables all the nice things that we take for granted when we're talking about how markets create order in commercial affairs. Many of you are economics students or otherwise have seen supply and demand. You understand how prices adjust to clear markets and how that results in markets supplying the quantity of a good in a specific unit of time that more or less equals the quantity demand for that good without there being any sort of central coordinator and a central planner. Great. That's Econ 101. It's very important. We should emphasize it first and foremost. What's not usually emphasized, at the introductory level at least, is that this requires the use of money as a social institution. This nice process for coordinating economic activity relies on, in part, business organizations, firms, conducting profit and loss calculations. By using market prices as an input into profit and loss calculations, firms can ascertain the value of what they put on the marketplace across various production lines and production processes. So not only can I find out, am I offering the market something that it likes, I can also figure out whether I, the firm, am producing that good or goods in the cheapest way possible. The reason we can make these comparisons, the reason that someone who owns an Italian food restaurant, for example, can ask, well, would it make more sense for me to supply to the market more pasta, more panini, more pizza? Which one? Whichever one makes them the most profits, because that's the one that resembles the market signaling to that firm that it is using society's scarce resources in the most efficient way. But in order to make that comparison, each of those three activities, panini, pizza, pasta, has to be expressible in a common denominator. Profit and loss calculations, for which you need the institution from an accounting standpoint of money. That's really how markets coordinate, through the use of the market price system. If you study the market price system, prices adjusting on the market to clear markets, meaning bring supply and demand into alignment, you know that entrepreneurs use prices ex ante to guide their behavior going forward, ex post to figure out whether their production plans were feasible, right? Let's say I end up choosing to supply more pasta. I did that because I expected to make more profit. Now that I've actually gone and done the thing, I can check my books. Did it make me more money? Am I satisfying actual consumer wants? So you have an ex ante and an ex post function to the profit and loss system. And it also fosters creative decision making and entrepreneurship itself. If you're an entrepreneur, if you're an innovator, if you're an arbitrageur, if you're trying to do something new in the economy, having access to money prices to give you a gauge on the state of the market is what enables you to make those expectations about how your product is going to be received by the market. So again, all of this should be standard if you've had an economics background before. So we're not breaking any new ground yet, but what's important to realize is that all of this takes the institution of money and a money-using economy for granted. All this nice coordination, all this massive production, quantity supplied tending towards quantity demanded at a single price on the market, that's not something we're going to tend to observe in a barter economy. You need the institution of money, both for expectation and accounting purposes, to make all that nice stuff work. So here's a question for you. The working of a market economy depends on freely fluctuating market prices. The prices of the various goods and services we have in society are denominated in money. Things are priced in dollars in the US economy. Go into any store, you'll find prices expressed in dollars. They could be expressed in other units of currency. They could be expressed in other goods in a barter economy, but you won't see that because we are a money-using economy. So again, dollars are the common denominator of these exchanges. Here's a little bit of a puzzle. Money is an economic good. We prefer more of it to less. Everyone does. Economic goods are traded on markets. Money is a good that is traded on a market. And all goods, if they're traded on a market, have a price. So what is the price of money? kind of a strange question when you think about it. We're used to thinking of prices as something that are expressed in money. So many dollars for a slice of pizza, so many dollars for an apple, so many dollars for a vacation to Hawaii. But really, a price is just an exchange ratio. You're used to seeing dollars in the numerator and the good that you want to buy in the denominator. There's no reason it has to be that way. It's just the rate at which one good exchanges against the other. So just as we can talk about the dollar price of a slice of pizza, flipping that on its head, we can meaningfully speak of the pizza price of some dollars. How many slices of pizza does it take to buy a dollar? Buying and selling are just reciprocal sides of the transaction. Whether you're the buyer or the seller depends on your own point of view. We typically refer to the buyer as the consumer and the seller as the firm, but it doesn't have to be that way, right? That's just a point of convenience. So we need to tackle this issue of the price of money a little bit more. The price of money is ultimately a function of its purchasing power. Think about all the stuff that you buy on a regular basis. Now think about the money in your wallet. The ability of your money in your wallet to command those goods and services that you regularly buy, that gives you some information about the price of money. Right? So we need to move from thinking about the dollar price of goods to the goods price of dollars. In a world where your money doesn't go very far, goods in general are expensive. Money has a low price. In a world where goods in general have a low price, again, a given dollar goes much farther, and money has a high price, where price here means the exchange ratio at which dollars exchange for goods. Importantly, we're now talking about something that economists call the price level. The price level is a measure of money's purchasing power. So money's purchasing power is, in some sense, a relative price, which is the usual way we think about prices in microeconomics. But now we're also moving into the realm of macroeconomics. Precisely because money is one half of all exchanges, the price of money, because it can exchange for every good in the economy, the price of money is going to spill out into possibly every market in the economy. The implication of all this is that money itself, the institution of money, is the link between microeconomics and macroeconomics. Why is it that people who call themselves economists, on the one hand, study the production and consumption decisions of households and firms at the micro level, but then they also talk about business cycles and economic growth? Micro and macro, they seem like different things. What's the link between them? The institution of money is the link between them. And that's why we need to explore it more if we want to understand how monetary decisions by whoever's in charge of the monetary system spill over into macroeconomic outcomes. Does anyone know the name of the institution, I should say the organization, that is responsible for managing the money supply in the United States? I heard it over here somewhere. The Federal Reserve. What kind of organization is the Federal Reserve? It's an example of a what? A central bank. So the central bank is the general category, that's the institution. The Federal Reserve is a specific case of a central bank. The various countries that comprise the Euro Union, they have their own central bank, the European Central Bank. New Zealand has a central bank, Israel has a central bank. Pretty much all developed economies have a central bank. That is the institution that is responsible for managing the supply of that country's currency. What is the goal of these organizations? What are they trying to do? In brief, they're trying to maintain macroeconomic stability, fight the business cycle, make sure that the economy is neither running too hot nor too cold. Economists really like the Goldilocks spot. We like it just right. Whether we're talking about quantity supplied equals quantity demanded, not too hot, not too cold. We like equilibriums. We like stationary states. That's what we're always looking for to make sure that things are proceeding nicely and relatively predictably. So it's the Fed's job in the United States to adjust the supply of money in the economy to meet the demand to hold it. That's what maintaining monetary equilibrium means. Equilibrium in the market for pizza means quantity supplied of pizza equals quantity demanded of pizza at a given price. Equilibrium in the money market, the market for dollars held as transactional balances, means that the supply of dollars in the economy equals the demand to hold dollars at the going price of money, which is an inverse function of the price level, how expensive goods are in general. If we have an excess demand for money, if there's not enough cash in the economy to meet people's transaction demands, what people are going to try and do is stock up on their money balances, which means that they're going to engage in less economic activity as they try and build up their cash balances. Businesses are going to see falling revenue, they're going to lay people off. We have the recipe for a demand-side recession. That's the result of an unmet excess demand for money. In contrast, the result of an excess supply of money is going to be inflation. People find that they're holding more money than they currently want to hold. Well, one thing you can always do with money if you have too much of it is spend it. You could spend it on final goods and services, you can invest it in financial markets, you can exchange money for things that you want more. As everyone does that throughout the economy, prices in general rise and we get inflation. So an excess demand for money typically has deflationary or recessionary pressures, and excess supply for money, at least in the short run, typically has expansionary and inflationary pressures. It's important to note that from an economic standpoint, both of these should be avoided. Too hot and too cold are equally bad. This is something that economists sometimes have a harder time conveying to the general public. Most people think, well, a recession's obviously bad, but why would you ever be afraid of too much economic activity? Why would you ever be afraid of too much being produced and sold and consumed, too much investment? For the same reason that you should care about too many or too few apples or too many or too few slices of pizza. Yes, all else being equal, slices of pizza are an economic good and we prefer more to less. But we can't have more without producing more, and that production entails costs. And if we're producing more pizza than the opportunity cost of the resources, even though we have more pizza, we're less wealthy as a society. Same thing for pizza as for all goods and services in general, which is why a monetary-induced boom caused by an excess supply of money is actually a bad thing. Standard economic efficiency arguments. So it's the central bank's job, and in the United States, it's the Federal Reserve's job to make sure that we're constantly humming along at the economy's full potential. The Fed's job, if it can, is to maintain monetary equilibrium. It wants to make sure that in any given time period that it's making its decisions, there is neither an unmet excess demand nor an excess supply for money. That's the standard. How well has it performed? Bullet point 1. Not great, I would argue. On the Fed's watch, there have been at least 2 catastrophic missteps. Anyone know what they are? There have been at least 3 catastrophic missteps. We'll classify that as one of them. So economists actually disagree about whether that was well managed or not. I happen to think it was not well managed, but that's an insightful point. Your second one is correct. The recent financial crisis. I say recent, but it was more than 10 years ago now. The 2007 to 2008 financial crisis is the most recent big bungling of the Federal Reserve. There's one older, roughly 80, 90 years older. The Great Depression. The Great Depression has the word great in it, in part because the central bank mismanaged the money supply in the early days of the recession and made a market correction spiral into something much, much nastier. This is not just my opinion, by the way. Even Federal Reserve economists acknowledge that the Fed missed the Great Depression, that they got that one wrong. They deny that they got the Great Recession, the housing crisis, wrong, but I'm confident that when as much time has passed between now and that crisis as between now and the Great Depression, they'll come around to the fact that they messed that one up too. So for now, take my word for it that the Fed messed both of those things up. I should say, with all credit to the Federal Reserve, central banking is an incredibly hard job. It's really, really hard. You have to calibrate a theoretical model of the economy that accurately captures all the structural relationships. You have to basically fit that model to data to make sure that it's actually spitting out stuff that resembles the real world. And you need that model to not only fit all past data, but it needs to predict the future as well. And it needs to do it fast enough and accurately enough to make meaningful decisions about the stance of monetary policy. Given all the variables that influence economic activity, this is just about as hard as a modeling problem as there can be in the sciences. Not just the social sciences, the physical and the social sciences. So many moving parts, this is an inherently difficult task. So credit where credit is due, especially if you're a monetary economist between roughly 1983 and 2005, because those were the good years. We even have a name for that time period. It's called the Great Moderation. 1983 to 2005, there was pretty much no nasty recession. There were ups and downs in markets, of course, there always are, but there was never any significant recessionary event, and certainly nothing like the Great Recession of the early 20th, or the Great Depression of the early 20th century, or the Great Recession that was to come. So if you're a monetary economist in 2005, you could pat yourself on the back. We've solved the business cycle. We are at the end of short-run macroeconomic history. It's done. We have nothing more to learn. And then the housing crisis happened. And it turns out that everything we thought we knew, we did not, in fact, know. Both of these cases I attribute to the Federal Reserve because they did not fully appreciate, on the one hand, the link between monetary policy and interest rates, and more importantly, the link between interest rates and real economic activity. You may have noticed in my earlier definition of monetary policy, talking about maintaining monetary equilibrium, I hadn't yet brought up interest rates. And yet, in every Principles of Macroeconomics class, aren't we taught that monetary policy is about interest rates? You are taught that. And that's bad. You should not be taught that because it's not about interest rates. Interest is not the price of money. Interest is the price of time. When you borrow money, what you're really borrowing is time. You're transferring purchasing power from future you, who has a lot, to present you, who has less. Interest is the price that you pay to do that. The price that you pay to the intermediary, like the bank, to reallocate purchasing power from you in the future to you right now. Just because interest rates are expressed, rates of return on assets are expressed in money, does not make interest the price of money. Right? Exchange rates for apples are expressed in dollars. Nobody says that apples are the price of dollars or anything silly like that. So we need to remember that the price of money and the price of time, the price of capital, the price of borrowed savings are two very different things. These are not the same economic good. And if we do not realize that distinction, we're going to miss something crucial about how the real economy and the monetary economy can affect each other. That being said, the standard story about how monetary policy affects interest rates, at least in the short run, has a lot more going for it. It is true, all else being equal, that in the short run, expansionary monetary policy tends to lower market interest rates, at least right away, and contractionary monetary policy tends to raise interest rates, at least right away. Any time period longer than that, there are so many other factors at work that we can't say ex ante what's going to happen. But again, immediate short run, more money injected into capital markets by the Federal Reserve does tend to mean lower interest rates. But that's a side effect. It's not the essence of the thing itself. The essence of the thing is just making sure that there's more money because people demand more of it. The interest rate effect is a side effect. So how did the Federal Reserve fail in the case of the Great Depression? In brief, the money supply was collapsing and they didn't recognize it. It was their job to maintain the money supply conducive to the needs of trade, but they mistakenly looked at interest rates, thought that money was too loose, when in fact money was too tight. So the Federal Reserve failed to supply the market with liquidity when markets needed liquidity in the early 20th century. And that's part of the reason the Great Depression was as great as it was. More recently, with the housing crisis, this time they got it on both ends. The housing boom was fueled in part by a policy of artificially low interest rates maintained by the Federal Reserve for a period of almost 2 years prior to the housing bust. Artificially low interest rates incentivize artificially large amounts of investment, but because those rates are kept artificially low, they're not based on economic fundamentals. It's just a funny money effect. But if someone's offering you cheap liquidity, of course you're going to take it and run with it. You as an individual businessman, you as an individual investor, if someone's giving you cheap credit, of course you take it. You're going to grow your business. The problem is when everyone in the economy is thinking that way, and real economic conditions have not actually created those resources that you use for investment, all of those projects collectively are unsustainable. When the economy figures that out is when the bubble bursts. And so the recession, as nasty as it is the necessary corrective process to a period of artificial monetary expansion. Now that doesn't mean that the Federal Reserve couldn't do anything to tame or smooth the worst part of the business cycle. Even acknowledging that the Federal Reserve inflated the thing by keeping interest rates too low for too long and conducting monetary policy, they could have said, okay, this was us, our bad, we can at least help the economy have a relatively soft landing. But then they did the exact same thing that they did in the Great Depression. They looked at interest rates, thought, actually, these look okay, everything is fine, and they let the most narrow measure of the money supply collapse. There was a global flight to liquidity, a global flight away from assets towards safer assets, a general slowdown in economic activity. The Fed, instead of meeting that liquidity demand, mostly limited itself to conducting some form of asset swaps by shoring up large banks' balance sheets. There was a good theoretical reason for that, but not a good theoretical reason to allow the money supply to collapse. And because the central bank didn't do the one thing that it was supposed to do, stop the money supply from collapsing, because it didn't do that thing, the Great Recession, the crisis of 2007 to 2008, was really the Great Depression 2.0. Same mechanism, same effect, separated by almost a century. It seems that learning from our mistakes in the past is indeed very, very hard, to the unfortunate consequence of many. Here's my evidence, in brief, for the argument that monetary policy in the form of interest rates was overly loose for too long before the crisis. So again, monetary policy is ultimately decided by how much money there is in the economy, dollar bills that are being pumped in by the Fed and its printing press. In the short run, that can have an effect on interest rates. In this graph, the blue line is the actual federal funds rate, the market interest rate that the Fed uses to ascertain the short-run stance of monetary policy. It's also the rate at which banks loan each other money overnight to meet reserve requirements set by the Federal Reserve. The red line is its estimated Taylor rule rate. John Taylor, a professor of economics at Stanford University, who's almost certainly going to win the Nobel Prize sometime in the next 10 years, famously devised a rule for knowing whether monetary policy has an appropriate effect on interest rates, or more accurately, whether market interest rates accurately reflect what's going on with monetary policy. Basically, whatever the rule spits out, whatever the Taylor rule says the interest rate should be, is based on the one hand, monetary, and on the other hand, real economic factors. It's basically a measure of what's going on in markets that helps policymakers figure out what interest rates should be. Should, because we never really observed the relevant counterfactual, but this is as close as we can get when we're doing actual policy work. No measure is perfect. No estimate is perfect. The red line's about as good as anybody has come up with. Notice what happens starting in the early 2000s. Market rates fall, and they fall sharply below what the Taylor rule rate says they should be. That's evidence that the market has mispriced capital, has mispriced investment resources. Borrowing money is too cheap. It does not reflect real economic fundamentals. Capital is actually more scarce at the margin than markets thought it was from about 2003 to 2006, starting in 2003 and then going up through the start of the crisis. How can that be? Only because the Federal Reserve was actively running the printing press. That's the only way you can get and keep a divergence between the market rate of interest and what the rate of interest should be, its natural or counterfactual equilibrium rate. So a lot of economists are coming around to the explanation that part of the reason that we had a bubble in financial markets and real estate markets was because of that divergence, was because the Federal Reserve partly, in case you're interested, because it was trying to still smooth over the last lingering results from the dot-com bust from '01 to '02, '99 to '02 really, if you want to count the full-time period. Partly for that reason, they erred on the side of going for a soft landing to the previous crisis, and so inadvertently sowed the seeds of the next crisis. Unfortunately, that's frequently how these things work. When you try and stem off one bad thing, you inadvertently court another. The next graph that I want to show you is the nominal GDP gap. Nominal GDP is just every good and service that's produced in an economy in a given year expressed in current market prices, provided that it's actually sold on the market. Basically, nominal GDP for the United States tells you in dollars how big the US economy is. Final sales expressed in current dollars. Macroeconomically, nominal GDP is equivalent to aggregate demand, the ability of the economy to purchase goods and services considered in aggregate. Because it's expressed in current dollars, and because dollars are ultimately a monopoly of the Federal Reserve in terms of producing them, nominal GDP is largely, not 100%, but largely under control of the Fed. The Fed has complete control over a measure of the money supply that we call the monetary base, the most narrow measure of the money supply on which all other measures of money are built upon. When people take that monetary base and spend it, putting it in the banking system, taking it out of the banking system, spending it on financial assets, real goods and services, whatever, that's how the monetary base gets channeled onto real GDP. It's the Fed's job to actually maintain, as well as it can, constant nominal GDP growth. Whatever the underlying rate of economic growth in the economy, the Fed is doing its job when it keeps the economy growing at roughly that pace as expressed in current dollars. So you'll see prior to 2007, there are some deviations of the blue line, which is actual nominal GDP, from the red line, which is its trend growth rate. But for the most part, things were on track. A little bit below here, a little bit above there, and then the financial crisis happens, and we get that big drop. That's prima facie evidence that the Federal Reserve actually bungled the recovery. So they were responsible by creating artificially low interest rates for the bubble in the first place. And then after that, when the bubble burst, they did not do what they were supposed to do to fix it. Red on both sides of the ledger in this case. So why has central banking done such a bad job? It's not because central bankers are dumb. Pretty much all of them are smarter than I am, and I'm a pretty clever guy. It's not because they're evil. They have the public's best interest at heart. I am convinced that Ben Bernanke is a good, honorable man. That was the chairman of the Fed during the financial crisis. So it's got to have some other explanation, something that has to do with the intrinsic difficulty of managing the money supply. I would argue that the Fed fails to do what it wants to do because it is ultimately a means-ends inconsistent approach to monetary policy. If you want macroeconomic stability, central banks are not the monetary institutions you want to embrace. You don't want central banking. You want something else. That's my contention. Figuring out what that something else is an important job for comparative institutional analysts, like the gentleman in the back, for going forward and understanding how we're going to figure out what we're going to do with respect to designing institutions in the future to get better, I shouldn't say policy, because you wouldn't have monetary policy proper if there were not a central bank, but you would have monetary outcomes. You would still have macroeconomic outcomes. And the question is, if we're not going to use central banks to get those kinds of outcomes, what are we going to use? There are actually multiple answers to this question. This is an ongoing research area in the comparative political economy of monetary policy. And while it's probably too early to specify a single best institutional alternative, we can say what we want our monetary institutions to do, to look like. Whatever our monetary institutions are, whatever they look like, whatever we've got, they have to adhere to the rule of law. The rule of law is the standard. Just like it is for any public organization, right? We expect the government to follow the law. The legitimacy of the government in the United States rests in part on the fact that those who govern us do not get to play by a different set of rules from those who are governed. That's what rule of law means. My argument is that that insight, which is traditionally relegated to political philosophy, be extended to be a standard by which we evaluate monetary institutions. That's my contention going forward. Our goal is stable, predictable, and non-discriminatory monetary institutions that also do a good job of maintaining macroeconomic stability. Now, each of those three criteria actually mean something specific, and I want to go a little bit more into what those things mean. So the political philosophical perspective that I think makes the most sense to bring to bear on this question is that of classical liberalism. This is probably a term that needs to be unpacked just a little bit because in American public life and contemporary American politics, the word liberal simply means whatever happens to be on the left. That's not what the word means historically considered. Liberalism refers to the body of social thought that arose out of the various European Enlightenments going back to the late 17th century. Everything that came out of that is liberalism, which means including the very founding of the United States. The United States is a pro-Enlightenment project. That's fine. We just have to make sure that we adequately define our terms. So we're using this word liberal to mean something very different than it's used in contemporary political discourse, and using it to tie ourselves and engage ourselves in a more robust tradition of thinking about how societies can be self-governing and lawful at the same time. In the classical liberal tradition, in order for the rule of law to hold, you need your public institutions to behave generally, predictably, and non-discriminatorily. All three of those things have to be true. Generality basically means there's not going to be different laws for different groups. One law for everybody. Different people do not get to play by different rules. There doesn't get to be a different law for the great and the mighty as there are for the poor and the weak. One law, one standard. Predictability. We don't want our cases to be arbitrary. If you have a predictable institution, you more or less understand how that institution is going to make decisions and probably have a pretty good idea of what those decisions are going to be. Predictability is important because it can help people who are subject to those institutions anchor their expectations. And if I have a reasonable expectation about what the rules of the game are going to be, it is easier for everybody to coordinate their activity with each other, not to mention just more fair, generally. Lastly, non-discrimination. We don't want rules or procedures or outcomes that artificially advantage some groups over others. To the extent that people are governed by an institution, we would expect everyone to benefit from that institution. It should not be an instrument of predation, privileging some groups over others. I would claim that central banking does not fit any of these three criteria. We can point to specific instances where central banking has failed on each one of these three things. For example, especially in the context of the US Federal Reserve, monetary policy is very, very difficult to figure out what the monetary policy decision makers are thinking. Monetary policy decision making is notoriously opaque. This has gotten better in recent years, now that the Federal Reserve has done a better job about releasing its minutes, but it's still very much a group of people getting into a room and trying to figure out what the future stance of monetary policy is going to be, and markets are frequently surprised by what they decide. The extent to which markets are surprised by central banks is a direct measure of the extent to which central banks are not behaving predictably. On another criterion, think about all the bailouts that happened in the early days of the financial crisis. What frequently happened was, although there were different arguments for it, large, well-connected financial institutions that had a significant political presence in Washington got bailouts. And smaller banks, those that did not have a similar political presence in Washington, did not. Furthermore, this was so even though it was frequently the smaller and less well-connected institutions that actually had the healthier balance sheets. Everyone's balance sheet was going south. It was a financial crisis. But one of the sound rules of bailing out banks, if you're going to bail them out, is to make sure that you only lend to money that to people that did not engage in irresponsible, exuberant behavior during the heydays of the boom that preceded the crisis. Well, when it turns out, you look at who actually got the emergency liquidity provided by the Federal Reserve, it was all the guys who were doing the questionable stuff. The relatively sane conservative bankers, they tended to get shut out. That violates both generality and non-discrimination. So how much time do we have left? All right. I'm going to skip over this slide just in the interest of time. We can come back to it if we have a little bit of time. How can we make monetary arrangements lawful? What do lawful monetary institutions look like? What we're really looking for is a monetary constitution, a constitution for monetary policy. Now, in economics, the word constitution means something specific. It means the rules for making rules. The Constitution of the United States of America is a rule sheet for how rules are going to be made, the rules for those who make the rules. In that sense, a monetary constitution is a rule that binds or constrains the monetary authorities and basically places limits on the kinds of behaviors they can engage in. Now, if you look at the contemporary monetary policy literature, you see all sorts of nice things about monetary rules. Monetary rules are great. Monetary rules are nice. We want to have them. The difference between a monetary rule and a monetary constitution is that central bankers are bound by the latter. You frequently see guys like Ben Bernanke writing about how they behave according to what is called constrain discretion, which you really unpack it, constrain discretion, which when you unpack it means I follow a monetary rule until I don't feel like following it anymore, at which point I stop following it. Well, then you don't really have any benefit to a rule. It's not a rule if it doesn't bind. We need a genuine institutional constraint placed on monetary policymakers that makes their behavior general, predictable, and non-discriminatory. So as an aside, one thing I want to point out at this stage is that while we're considering radical reformations to our monetary institutions, do not under any circumstances place the day-to-day operations of the Federal Reserve under the auspices of Congress. Don't do that. The Fed prints money. Congressmen and congresswomen are on short-term election cycles. They get reelected when the economy is doing well. If you put the central bank under the control of people who are on short-term election cycles, what do you think you're going to observe? Just before every election, we're going to expect to see the printing presses being run and then stopped afterwards, which means we're going to have a crash afterwards, but hey, they're safe for 2 to 6 years, so who cares? This is why we typically do not necessarily want direct popular oversight of monetary institutions. Rule of law does not mean always and everywhere subject to democratic procedures. If all we wanted were democratic procedures, we wouldn't have a Congress in the first place. Right? There are times where you want to insulate public decision makings just from majority rule. This is a very important instance of that. But just because we're insulating it from majority rule does not mean we want it immune to public pressure. The people have a right to express their opinion about their institutions, including monetary institutions. And so we need a way in which we can have meaningful public input into what this thing looks like without direct popular control of monetary policy. My contention is the way that manifests is itself the rule of law. That's what we should look for. Same thing in monetary institutions as we look for in Congress and the judiciary and the executive and every other institution of public importance. That applies there, the rule of law does. We should apply it here as well. It's all well and good to say that you want a monetary constitution that maintains the rule of law, but what's it look like? We have a pretty good idea of what it should do, but what should it be? What should make it up? There are actually a number of ways we can go with this. You don't need to abolish the central bank per se, just abolish central bank discretion. Give it a rule that it must follow, that it does not have the option to break. One example would be a perfectly stable purchasing power of money. No inflation and no deflation. The dollar is something like an inch on a ruler. It's a fundamental unit of measurement that will never change. That has some benefits to it. It certainly gives us lots of predictability if the purchasing power of the dollar will never change. But it turns out that it can have some nasty macroeconomic effects, especially in the case of things like natural disasters that tend to cause what economists call negative supply shocks. In brief, when there are nasty things happening on the supply side, a constant purchasing power of money would cause, at least in the short run, things to get even worse because the central bank, in changing the purchasing power of money, would have to compound the nasty stuff going on the supply side. Now, maybe that's actually not so bad compared to perfect stability. Maybe having a perfectly stable and secure dollar is so important that those bad macroeconomic effects are actually worth it, right? Just because costs are high doesn't mean that benefits can't be higher. Maybe it's worth it. That's something we should discuss. Another one, go back to a gold standard. Markets work for pizza, markets work for vacations, markets can work for money as well. Let markets pick the fundamental unit of exchange. If we know anything about history, they tend to be rather fond of gold as money. Let the market go back to a commodity system, define the dollar as supplied by the government as a certain weight of money as determined by the market, and then allow monetary institutions to operate onto that. Again, that has the benefit of predictability. It has the cost that changes in the market for actual provision of gold will spill over into monetary factors. So if you imagine a new mining system is discovered and it's twice as efficient as the existing mining standard, and that doubles the amount of gold that's produced every year. Well, if gold is money and we've doubled the amount of gold that we've produced, we've essentially doubled the money supply. And that can have some unintended and sometimes unfortunate side effects. None of these are a free lunch. They're all going to come with benefits and they're all going to come with costs. The purpose that we can engage in, and this is where the project really touches on issues that pertain to self-governance, is to have a public conversation about what those benefits and costs are and pick the one that seems to us most conducive to economic, commercial, political flourishing. My preferred alternative is simply to remove any and all restrictions on money, banking, and finance. A complete free market in the provision of financial instruments, including the most common financial instrument, money. This is not just theory. We actually have some pretty good historical cases that approximate completely free markets for money. There was nothing perfect, and there probably never will be. But the three that I always like to talk about are Canada and its history throughout the First World War, Sweden for about the first half of the 19th century, and Scotland during the entirety of the 18th century. Very, very, very few restrictions on money and banking. And yet, despite the fact that they had a complete free market in money, they all experienced phenomenal economic growth and monetary, financial, economic stability. Their rule of law for monetary policy was just the general rule of law for property, contracts, and torts applied to banking. The same rules that work for any other good or service can also apply to money. The common law, the Anglo-American common law of commerce. Same institutions, just have them apply to banking too. Money is not sufficiently special that it needs its own institutions. Let the rule of law in monetary policy be the rule of law in all things, all goods and services that we transact in on a daily basis. And it turns out that this actually works pretty well. One brief piece of trivia before we close for the night. Anyone know about how many banks failed in the Great Depression in the United States? About 8,000. Anyone know how many banks failed in Canada during the Great Depression? Not one. Not one bank failure due to the Great Depression in Canada. There's a reason for that. It's not that Canada is just economically different. In fact, a lot of their markets were already in the early 20th century well integrated with US markets. The reason is their institutions were better. There's no reason that we can't have those institutions as well. So, in conclusion, let's sum up. We've covered a lot of territory, so it might be worthwhile to do a brief recap. Money greatly increases the extent of markets, but the use of money creates a macroeconomic problem in the sense that we can now have monetary disequilibria, which can cause general expansions or recessions. Central banking was last century's great attempt to cope with this problem. Central banks' job was to fight recessions and to fight artificial booms as well. They existed to solve the money problem, to try and maintain monetary equilibrium. Unfortunately, they didn't do a very good job of it because they vested too much discretionary and unaccountable power in the hands of central bankers. We can improve our outcomes if instead of discretionary central banking, we move to a rule of law system for monetary policy. Perhaps we don't need to abolish the central bank. Perhaps we can keep the fiat dollar, we just freeze the supply of it and keep a stable purchasing power of money. Perhaps we move to a specific gold standard. Perhaps we just remove any and all restrictions and let the rule of law and commerce in general apply to money in particular. Perhaps we do something different than any of these three things. What's important is we realize that central banks and the Fed in particular have not adhered to their mandate. They have not done what they promised they would do, which is deliver economic stability. It's important that we figure this out because otherwise it's just going to be a matter of time until the next financial crisis. And we're going to be stuck in this loop of boom, bust, until we can get institutions that can best ameliorate these problems. Thank you all for your time and attention.